Right, so today I'm going to talk about WebPageTest and Cloudflare Workers as a combination. One of the challenges that I have as a consultant is I'm often engaged to look at somebody's site as it exists now. And then I'm trying to use my knowledge and my experience and my ability to test web pages to make recommendations on how they can improve the performance of a site, how the customer can improve the performance of the site. And one of the challenges with that is it can sometimes be a long process. Sometimes I'll sit on site with a client for 2 days every other week and work through incremental changes with them. Sometimes I'm writing reports that get sent out and implemented, and then the results come back to me for checking. And the challenge is making websites faster can sometimes be surprising. Web page load has non-deterministic characteristics about it. You can't always guarantee that the resources on a page will load in the same order. We can generally guarantee if we make stuff smaller, the page will get faster. But once we start moving things around, reordering the head or pre-connecting to third parties, we get unexpected results. And one of the things I've been wanting to do for a long time is escape those unexpected results, have some idea that if we make this change, what the outcome's going to be. Many years ago so one of the ways I would do that currently is using Chrome DevTools and content overrides. But I don't get the nice film strip I get with WebPageTest, so I can't create two tests I can compare side by side. I'm running it on my machine or on a phone. So it's not a particularly stable test environment. And one of the things back when Simon and I worked together is Simon created a proxy. He was trying to create a way that we could prove to clients that they could make their websites faster. So he ran up mod page speed as a proxy. And it was a bit of a pain to use. It wasn't the simplest thing to use, but you could get an idea of how much you could make a website faster. And then back last year, Pat Meenan and Andrew Galoni of Cloudflare started talking about how you could do this with WebPageTest, how you could use Cloudflare Workers to create a programmable proxy, and then how you could test them with WebPageTest. And I'd read these reports and thought, this is fab. Took me a while to get around to playing with it, but having done some real exercises with it and some work with clients with it, it's become part of my general day-to-day workflow. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take my life in my hands. So you've seen 2 of the 3 slides I have. I have one more slide after that. But just to reiterate something, everything I'm doing today is covered in this blog post by Andrew. I will update my slides with the examples I'm using and upload them to Gnosis at the end. But if you read this blog post, you will be 90% of the way there. And what I'm going to do is go through an exercise of how I might take this page. So this is OPI, the American nail varnish company, how I might improve the performance of this page. And I originally started doing this example so it's a page. I've got it in mobile form. It's got some big product images. I can't work the slider on emulation, but you see through it. So it's got some product images. It's got recommendations. It's got some more images. It's got a YouTube video down the bottom. And what I did is in the beginning, I loaded this in WebPageTest, if I get the right one. And if we go look at the median view for it, and we'll look, I'm going to do all this from a film strip point of view as to judge whether we're getting faster or slower. And if we go look at it from a film strip point of view, and this is the first test I did. If we go out to 1 second, we see that it straight away, if you think back to Simon's talk, it fails some of those characteristics of how quickly we should put content on the screen, how quickly we should give our visitors hints. In that, it takes 2.6 seconds to show the main product image. You can slightly see there's some gray background here where it started painting to the screen earlier, but it's not particularly quick. So then I get into digging into, well, why is this so slow? What's going on, and what could I change about it? And you know, we get a typical looking waterfall. I'll admit I cheated with this one, and I went looking for sites that used Qubit Smart Serve in the HTTP archive, because I often know while I'm doing a demo, I can get good bang for buck out of those. But we see, you know, there's a bunch of CSS. There's Qubit Smart Serve. We're using Font Awesome from Bootstrap. There's some stuff from the Google APIs library. There's some font. We've got Bizarre Voice, my favorite third party of all time. And then somewhere down here, we actually get the product image that starts to appear. So my challenge then becomes, or our challenge as web performance people becomes, is what do we need to do to make this page faster? What can we do to improve the user experience? And I'm not going to show you how to install all the Cloudflare tools. You can go read their support articles for that. But one thing WebPageTest brought in is something called the override host command, which means you can have one server pretend to be another server for test purposes. So what I do is I start by writing a very simple proxy in JavaScript that becomes the Cloudflare worker. And it's got a service worker style interface. From Cloudflare's perspective, Akamai's is pretty similar to this. It has differences, and I'll get to play with Fastly sooner or later as well. So our Cloudflare worker is listening for fetch events, and then we're going to respond with something. And this is how I start as a boilerplate. This is just a proxy. So I check whether the request is for robots.txt, because I don't want any search engines indexing this, because if you write a proxy and a search engine indexes it, you may steal somebody's traffic, as Simon once discovered. He stole a UK Airlines SEO traffic through his proxy. I also check whether there's an X host header, because when you use the override host command in WebPageTest, it sets X host to the real host. So we 403 if there's no host header. Otherwise, we just create a proxy and go and fetch from the original site. And one of the ways to too many browser windows, to start using this in WebPageTest is I'll run a test so you can see. Bear with me while I cut and paste. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use WebPageTest is script injection to set a local storage value that gets rid of a pop-up that says, oh, you're in America. Do you want to stay in America? Because they're really annoying. Cleaning up film strips is a great way when we're communicating with customers. Then I'm going to emulate the mobile browser. And then I'm going to actually show you what our script looks like. I've lost my mouse. Right. Okay. So the first bit to really look at is this line here. Let's make it a bit bigger. So the override host script command. And what that's saying is to WebPageTest is when I get a test, when I get a request to opi.com, send it to demoproxy.steno.workers.dev, and then navigate to OPI's page and test it. And I can not just do this for OPI. When we get to HTTP2, for example, one of the things we try to encourage people to do is unshard their domains, to stop requesting fonts from Font Awesome or Bootstrap, stop requesting jQuery from Google, and host them yourself, because it allows HTTP2 prioritization to work more effectively. So what I'm going to do here is just add in a couple more hosts. So I'm going to proxy Bootstrap onto the same domain. I'm going to proxy Google APIs, and I'm going to proxy my fonts. And then we'll run that test off. And while that's running, what we can do is we can go to the Blue Peter example I created earlier, where we can begin to see some of the changes when it loads that I've made to the page. So you can see straight away that jQuery is now coming from my proxy. The Font Awesome is coming from my proxy. So we've got rid of those other requests. You can still see SmartServe and Bazaar Voice, but you know. So what that means is, if we compare performance, one thing I'll explain. Compare performance just by getting rid of those other domain lookups, those other TLS connections we're making in the head. We've already made the page faster, and we've made that product image appear much sooner. Now, one thing I should say is I actually ran a test first time around, making no changes to the page and just proxying OPI. So I had a stable baseline that went through the proxy, so I could compare any changes I was making to the page or any changes I was making by proxying other domains. Because when I did this test, first of all, I did find that routing it through Cloudflare, it wasn't this site, it was another site actually, routing it through Cloudflare actually made the page faster without doing anything else. So straight away, we've tested self-hosting jQuery, we've tested self-hosting Font Awesome. But if we go back to this waterfall, we begin to see, when the waterfall appears, we begin to see some of the other things on the page. And one of the things to look at is notice how much some of these segments in web page test requests are stretched out. If we look at Qubit for here, SmartServe, it's stretched out quite a lot. And that's because it's competing for that final mile connection. It's competing for bandwidth. And the same for Bazaar Voice. And our images are competing for bandwidth with Bazaar Voice again below. So we've got this huge amount of contention going on the page. And what I then try to do in these situations is start to choreograph the page, start to control when things load. So this is when I skip into DevTools and see how the page itself is organized. When it loads. Just refresh it a minute. So we can see straight away when we look at the source code, we can see things like there's Google Tag Manager. Let's get rid of that. It's Google Tag Manager loaded asynchronously in the beginning. And then we've got Hotjar loaded. Well, Hotjar doesn't really make any sense until a visitor's got an experience in front of them, until they've got something to interact with, because Hotjar's a session recorder. Then we can see smart servers loaded with async and defer really early on, bizarre voice injected, and then we get eventually down to the style sheet. So we're straight away in pushing lots of JavaScript into the page that's not really needed until later. So then we can get to a second feature of Cloudflare's Workers, in that there's a component called HTML rewriter. So we can begin to actually change the contents of the page as it comes through our proxy. And this is what it looks like from a code point of view. So I set a header. So if I want to bypass the transforms, I can set an X bypass transform header in WebPageTest. Then I check what's being requested. This is a really rough and ready check that I'm about to work on a HTML document. And don't forget, all these things I'm doing are throwaway code. So they don't have to be perfect, but you could set this up to be a particular URL or a particular HTML page. But often I like to use this where I have site is set to OPI. So I'm checking it from on opi.com and checking whether the request is for HTML. And I'm checking I'm not don't want to bypass the transform. So I could sequence up a set of pages in WebPageTest and try a customer journey with all the transforms I'm about to show you. And then we fetch the page from the origin, and then Cloudflare has this HTML rewriter that allows us to use CSS-like selectors and start to transform bits of the page. And what I'm going to do in the beginning is I'm going to move, let's take this out. So this is the transform to find smart serve. We're just going to get the other bit of the code. Selector is finding the script object that, or the script element in script tag in the page that has the qubit script in it, and it essentially, I'll get my mouse back in a minute, just removes it. And then we have another one that goes and finds the head element and just adds it back in at the end of the head. So straight away, we can go through this process of moving smart serve out from in front of the CSS to behind the CSS in document order. Some other things that we'll do while we're here in the interest of time is there's some errors in the head. If you know much about document parsing, and I've got to admit, I didn't know about this one, I think, until Harry Roberts told me about it, is there's only a limited number of HTML elements that are valid in the head of the page. There's about 7. Remy Sharp has a blog post about it. And quite often, third parties use fallbacks. They use image fallbacks for advertising attribution pixels, or they use iframe fallbacks for Google in GTM cases. And what you sometimes see is things like this, where we have the Facebook pixel here, and then we have this no script code after it. And within that no script code, there's an image element, but the image element is not a valid HTML element in the head. So what happens is the browser terminates the head at that point and starts the body, which has an impact on loading. So the other thing I'm going to do while I'm here is I'm going to add just another section to find any those script elements in the head and remove them. And if we save that and then publish it using Wrangler, which is the tool used to wrangle workers. Why it's called Wrangler, I don't know. It gets published, and what we can do is we can go back to our web page tests and kick off the test we did again earlier with the same features in it and run it. But again, in the essence of time, I did it earlier. So here's the test after I consolidated domains, and here's the one where I've both removed the invalid head elements and moved smart serve on. And what we can find is we've actually only gained a little bit of time here. We can see that the product image appears slightly sooner. The menu starts to appear much sooner. So we're doing things that improve the visitor experience. If they were a bit keener on loading the logo, so when it loaded when the menu icon appeared, we'd get, it would be a much better experience. But we can see that we're beginning to pull this visual experience forward and improve it, and without having to actually commit any code to live yet, or customers not having to push anything through their development lifecycle. The other thing, when we were looking at the page, let me just get the right one up. When we go back to the waterfall, we can look at the waterfall again. Top tip is, when you do this, build a bigger private instance than I built. We can still see there's things like bizarre voice getting in the way. There's this annoying little CSS file that's actually empty. It's imported into one of the other CSS files, and I presume it's used for license tracking by the Font Foundry, but we could block that. We can see there's an iframe API coming in. We can still see that smart servers come a lot further down the waterfall. Smart servers now being loaded after our images. So, but our images are still stretched out as if they're competing for bandwidth with bizarre voice. Oh, and there's an embedded YouTube player, because for some reason the YouTube player doesn't lazy load by default. It loads everything in its iframe. So let's see what we can do to improve this. And one of the first things to sort of do, copy and paste quickly, is we can actually start to tackle some of these bizarre voice and Hotjar challenges. These get really fragile sometimes, some of these selectors. So if you look at the selectors I've just inserted, we're looking for the second script block in the head because there's no IDs on these script blocks. So if the page changes, this will break. This may not transfer from one page to another. And so first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the Hotjar script block and wrap it in a window loaded handler. So it'll essentially defer loading the script until window on load is fired. What I do in reality with customers is I get them to put Hotjar in their tag manager and use the onload trigger in their tag manager to load it. I'm going to remove bizarre voice from the head. There's also another bizarre voice script inserted somewhere later in the document because their bizarre voice implementation looks a bit messed up. So I'm going to remove the one in the head, I'm going to remove one later, and then I'm going to reinsert it just before the images appear, or the reviews appear, sorry. So this is where I'm deferring bizarre voice, and I'm just literally at the start of that script block, I'm adding the window add event listener and the function to wrap it, and then at the end I'm closing it off, and then at another point I'm taking the bizarre voice script and just injecting it there manually by hand. And again, we would go and push this and publish it, and it'll publish itself, and we can do another run. And what I did is I created one earlier where I deferred Hotjar and bizarre voice, and we can see that actually deferring Hotjar and pushing bizarre voice back a bit has got us another 0.3 of a second in terms of when that product image starts to appear. It loads fully here as if there's something at this point, whether a script is running and has interrupted image decoding. I'm not quite sure. I probably want to look at that in a bit more depth. But we've got to a point here where we've improved it further. So we've gone from wherever we were 3 seconds at the beginning down to 2 seconds. And the one last thing I will show you is if you've ever seen it on CSS Tricks, there's a really great article about how you can lazy load the YouTube player based on demand. Rather than loading it by default, you can load the poster image, load a fake play button on it, and when somebody presses play, it loads the YouTube player underneath. And I do this with clients all the time, where they're using YouTube in their product videos. We do this, and it speeds up some of their product demo pages enormously. So the last thing I'm going to do, sorry, I never know which way around my screens are, it's terrible. So I'm going to find the iframe that's the YouTube player, and then I'm going to actually rewrite it to be the lazy loaded version. And what I'm doing at this point is I'm using the HTML rewriter to extract a bunch of attributes that are assigned to the iframe, such as width, height, what the URL is, so I can extract the video ID out of it. And then I'm creating the iframe with the right code to lazy load the video player. And then I published that and tested it earlier. Get these two. And didn't actually make that much difference. We've got forward a little bit more, but I wouldn't really count that as an improvement. But you can the right one. Yeah, so the YouTube player's gone from here. What I did notice when I tested this previously is the image, because the YouTube player is no longer competing with these images, then they're starting to load much quicker. And if we actually go back to my full set results and look at the baseline versus where we started out, you know, we can see that now we get the menu button appearing at 1.7 seconds, whereas it used to appear at 2.3, and we get a product image at 2 seconds, where it used to appear at 2.6. There is something, and the logo and the heading for the product, you know, is way earlier. So got to a point where using a programmable proxy, we've been able to experiment with changing the page and changing the structure of the page before I give the clients instructions on how to on what they should do to improve performance. But even looking at this waterfall as it is now, there are still plenty of other things that we could go look at. We could look at, should we pre-connect to some of these third parties, or what effect would pre-connecting have? If we pre-connected to Bazaar Voice, for example, what we'd probably find is Bazaar Voice JavaScript loaded earlier and actually push back images. So I found this a really powerful way to go and play with, experiment with pages. And you can even do it in the browser. You can test, because one of the challenges here is the CSS queries we're making in the HTML rewriter are not the ones you can write in your browser console, because there's no JavaScript running in the CSS rewriter. So we can, using a Chrome extension that sets cookies, I can set an X-host cookie of OPI, and I can then use my proxy and actually reload the page live in the browser through the proxy. So I can see this weird wacky finger. You can see the other stuff starting to appear. We can actually see that I did actually make a lazy loading video YouTube player that worked. So we can begin to test that. Not only have we made it faster from a waterfall point of view, but we can begin to check that it actually still works as it's supposed to, which, you know, fundamentally, if we're gonna make things faster, they still need to work. There's still lots of stuff to play with it. That's like a whistle-stop tool. I haven't played with storing stuff in the cache or the Cloudflare optimizations you get out of the box, or doing things like creating replacements for CSS and JavaScript. So taking their jQuery UI that they're using, for example, and creating a smaller version, sticking it in a cache and loading itself. I wrote a blog post that will tell you more. Pat wrote some great example. Pat has some great examples on GitHub that are more advanced than mine, that I would suggest some of them are for actually fixing problems for real on sites or for issue with somebody's CMS. Cloudflare have a bunch of docs. I will create a slide deck from the demos I've done today. And what I'll do is I'll push all the tests I did on my private instance into WebPageTest and include links in there too. So you can see examples of the code and examples of what impact that had on the performance of the page and on the visitor experience. And I suspect if you're an Akamai customer, you can go do the same thing with Akamai's edge workers, and no doubt you can do the same things with Fastly's compute at the edge as well. But it's a really great way to go and play with performance optimizations without committing code to live. Thank you.